Sounds good. I'll let folks grab their seat and we'll get started with board questions. Well, Mr. Powell, I think I could almost say good evening now. So, series of different questions here, and I think one of the things I think has been advantageous is I did get to listen to landowners the last 2 weeks and heard a lot of different questions that were posed from them. I've taken pages and pages upon notes of things that I feel need to be asked on, the things I heard over the last couple weeks. And so some of these questions are going to stem from things that initiated some ideas there, and then series of questions also just based on your testimony. So, getting started here, the first thing, I've kind of thought about a lot of this in terms of themes, and one of the big themes is safety. So you have a lot of years of experience in the pipeline industry, correct?
Yes.
And so based on those experiences, this pipeline project in terms of safety compared to other pipeline projects you've done, is there any stark contrast? Have technologies advanced? What, through your knowledge and your experiences, what can you say about the safety of this pipeline?
I think technologies have advanced, and most prominently in manufacture of materials and in the raw materials available for manufacture of line pipe, for instance. It's the QA/QC process in the pipe mills, etc. Another unique thing to this project is, even though it's a large-scale project, it's the area. So, yes, there are populated areas in these 5 states and in Iowa, but compared to a lot of the pipeline construction that takes place in the Gulf Coast, the populated areas aren't quite as prevalent. So making routing of the pipeline is challenging, but not as challenging. From a safety perspective, there are aspects in routing in this part of the world when it comes to cultural features, etc., that make it more challenging, but not from a safety perspective. So I think the materials, construction techniques, types of equipment, and the things that we're doing to go above and beyond, like 100% X-ray, like looking at the dispersant analysis across the whole footprint, like employing the integrity management plan across the whole footprint, like employing lessons learned from the Satoshi incident, but other incidents. And also it's the fact that in this pipeline, we will be the first to employ PHMSA's guidance on a reduced distance between block valves. So I think when you couple the materials, which we're sourcing largely in the United States when available, and the QA/QC techniques, the contractors we're employing, and the areas that we're going above and beyond in safety and design, construction, and ultimately operation, I think make this one of the safest pipelines that I've been involved with.
So just as you stated earlier, probably about 30 public information meetings took place for this project. I think I did 20 plus of those, being the oldest board member here now. I know one of the things that was discussed, and we've heard it in the last 2 weeks as well, I heard it at those public information meetings, and I believe the response at the time when odorant was talked about is that there is research or experimenting going on right now of how to make some sort of an odorant work with carbon dioxide. Has that progressed?
We have done what I think is exhaustive analysis, and what we've come down to, or what it's come down to, is if you use a mercaptan like used in natural gas, and I've heard it said many times that natural gas pipelines are odorized. They're only odorized in residential service. Transmission lines are rarely, in my experience, odorized. But you're introducing, in CO2, you're introducing a flammable component in mercaptan, or a odorant-like mercaptan, into what's a non-flammable stream of product. And so it's the risk of then introducing that into the stream. And then there's a corrosivity risk as well. So we've got a chemical engineering consultant, process engineering consultant that's been working with us from day one. They've been involved in most of the CO2 projects in this country over the last several years, going all the way back to ADM Decatur. And they've done some extensive analysis, and we think the risk associated with corrosion and introducing that flammable component makes us not want to odorize the CO2.
And I believe the last name of the individual that was here the last 2 weeks, Frieders, I believe is the last name. They made a comment that going around safety, or sticking with safety, a warning system, a text messaging system to landowners, an alarm system, if you will, what is available or what could be used to alert or message landowners with a potential leak issue?
Yeah, I hate to pun on this one. I will tell you that Mr. Dillon is working with first responders and other pipeline operators to see what is the breadth of available sources, what we think may be effective. The challenge is in some places in Iowa, some places in South Dakota, and the other states, not everyone has a smartphone, etc. So it's trying to figure out what one area or one action or multiple actions would be most beneficial and allow us to communicate with the broadest group of people along the pipeline route. So we're working on that. I don't have that definitive answer as we sit here today.
And sticking with safety, and I think a lot of questions I had about training, working with the local first responders and whatnot. I think you asked some of the questions, or answered some of the questions on purchase of equipment and training supplies and whatnot. And I know from running a gas system myself, I know that we had to do annual training with our local first responders, but that was for a residential gas system, natural gas system. Does PHMSA require you to do, or will they require you to do annual training with first responders with a CO2 pipeline?
Yes, that's my understanding. And as I stated earlier, if more frequent training is requested, we'll try to accommodate that.
And there were some questions about the pressures in the last couple weeks that's going through this pipeline. There was a statement, and you might not be the right person. I guess I would consider it an engineering statement about 1 liter, and then it equals 80 liters when it hits atmosphere. Does that change occur?
Mr. Luke he's the chemical engineer, the dispersant expert, but I will tell you that when CO2 is introduced to the atmosphere, then there is an expansion of that CO2 as it vaporizes. As far as the volume of that expansion, I can't say for Member Burns, but Mr. Luke could, I'm sure.
And I believe Mr. Fair had some comments or some questions on the pressure of this pipe and what's in it. So what is the minimum pressure that you need to have in this pipe to maintain its status? And then what is the maximum that pipe can withstand?
So the maximum allowable operating pressure, I believe, is 2183. The maximum operating pressure is set now, I believe, is 2150. And Mr. Scrivener can confirm the minimum operating pressure to keep the CO2 in supercritical state is about 1,050, depending on the temperature. But I believe our minimum set point is about 1,300 pounds. So it'll discharge from an ethanol plant, let's say at 2150. And of course, the pressure will dissipate as it travels down the pipeline, and when it gets to the suction side of the first pump station, then it will be in that 1,300 range, and then it will be pressured back up through the pump station. Mr. Skubinik can confirm, but I believe that's generally correct.
Another item is obviously deals with soil compaction, tile repairs, wet conditions. I think we've addressed quite a bit of that today. I guess the one thing that maybe we didn't hear much from on wet conditions, when is it a go or no-go day when it comes to wet conditions? And there's some debate over the last 2 weeks. What is a wet condition?
Yeah, in my mind, a wet condition is a situation where the equipment being used for whatever stage of the pipeline construction we're in will do irreparables is probably a severe term, but do unnecessary damage to the area. Now we'll have in most of the areas in Iowa, we'll have mats, we'll have timber mats in place, and that'll kind of mitigate the risk associated with that. But it doesn't make sense, and I know what happens. It doesn't make sense for us when we're constructing or our contractors to work in weather or in conditions that compound the situation and make it more work in the end to finish the project and reclaim the property correctly. And then there's the compaction issue. We know as we're traversing this right of way with equipment and pipe, etc., that we're going to compact it. And I know that the IUB has specific requirements on how we decompact before we reclaim or as we reclaim. But we don't want to compound that and make that more difficult. So, and that's where the county inspectors come into play. So obviously we'll work with them and collaborate with them, before we begin construction to make sure we have perfect alignment or as near perfect alignment as possible around where is that line and when it doesn't make sense to work. And the contractor will be part of that conversation too. But I don't want to be in a situation where we cause more work, unnecessary work, and that we make it more difficult to reclaim the property. I can't tell you if that's 12 inches of mud or that's 6 inches of mud. It may be different depending on how much topsoil is there, etc.
I believe it was Mr. Utesh, had concerns with constant crossing of heavy equipment. Our farm equipment has gotten rather large. I honestly don't know how we can get any bigger than what we currently have today. But we do have really large farm equipment. I think the concern was the constant crossing over this pipeline with that heavy equipment. How do you mitigate that pressure from on top of that pipe below?
Yeah, we do, API 1111 calculations on what the max load would be, the live load, which is the traveling back and forth versus a dead load where it's stationary. And with the material we're using, the grade of material, the wall thickness material, and the compaction activity that will take over that pipeline, the risk of equipment damaging the pipeline, unless there's some extraordinary weather event and it sinks 4 foot on top of the pipeline, is very remote. So we've taken that into consideration.
We've heard a lot of conversations around a private, for-profit doing this project. You have a lot of years of experience in the pipeline business. What would you say is your percentage of projects you're doing with shareholders versus, pretty much our only other option is a municipal project. What is in your history, what have you seen? I'm curious.
Every project that I've been involved with, either with a publicly traded company or a private company, is for profit. So I've never been involved in the execution of a project that wasn't intended to generate a profit for the entity, whether it was public or private. So I don't really quite understand the distinction sometimes.
Have you done municipal projects?
I have not.
And just one last question from what I've taken as notes the last 2 weeks. Have you ever heard of cap CO2? That was something that came up quite a bit. And do you have any knowledge of cap CO2?
I don't.
And now we're going to get into some of your testimony. On page 4, line 12 through 14 of your direct testimony. We'll give staff a second to pull this up. Okay, so lines 12 through 14, you state that the pipeline system will be capable of shipping 18 million metric tons per year. Do you know the portion of that that's in Iowa?
And I can't, and every time you bring this up, anyone brings this up, I can't get past that typo in line 14, but I'll try this last time. Right now we have
So if we go to page 7 of your direct testimony, one of the things you brought up was the need of 4 pump stations in Iowa. So has Summit obtained all necessary land rights for those, or is it requesting the right of eminent domain over any of those areas?
Right now, even the pump stations, because not all 4 will be in this first phase of the project, I believe 2, Mr. Skubinik can confirm would be needed to reach or be able to ship 18 million tons. But I know Mike Rory and his team are working to secure sites for all pump stations, currently planned and future. And Mr. Rory can tell you exactly how many of those have been secured and how many have not. It's a large percentage that have been secured.
So you'll have that information.
Mr. Rory would,
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Do you know approximately, like, what are we talking for a footprint on these sites? Like, is there an acre amount typically?
It's the pump stations are, I want to say, 4 to 5 acres, so they're larger. And they're not, for energy transfer standards, are not large pump stations, but it's usually 2 to 3 pumps. They're enclosed in a structure, above ground piping, launcher, receiver, meters. It's a fairly simple station.
So I'm assuming they need some sort of an access driveway. Are they typically built close to the road? Is that where you try to keep them?
Close to the road and close to available power. But if not, yes, we'll have to negotiate with the landowner for the access to that pump station.
Well, let's stick with power. So you'll have to purchase electricity from local providers. Do you anticipate on generating any of your own energy out of that? Solar, anything renewable at those pump stations?
At this time, we are not. We are looking at that, but because of the timing, we always want to have a primary feed of available power from a power provider. But as a secondary feed, we are looking, especially at the pump stations, at solar.
And I believe Mr. Bentz from OCA, he had a direct exhibit 1. I don't know if you're aware of this. We'll get it pulled up. So Bentz direct exhibit 1, OCA data response 66. It states that Summit Carbon will pay for the necessary electric network upgrades. Do you know how many of these upgrades will need to happen?
It varies, and Mr. Skubinik will be able to add a lot more detail than I can, or Member Burns, but it's very few cases where we have to, and I think actually Shenandoah may be one, where we have to contract with a provider to build our own substation. Typically, we can upgrade existing infrastructure, and that's usually the existing substation, not new power coming into the substation.
Will there need to be any new electric transmission lines constructed to meet these needs?
Not that I'm aware of at the capture facilities. There may be an electrical drop to a mainline valve off the power line at the road, but not new infrastructure other than at the capture facilities. And I think that is very few, but Mr. Skubinik will be able to tell you exactly.
And have you begun any conversations yet with these electric utilities about this potential need?
Oh, yes, over a year ago. So we've been working with all of them. In fact, in some cases, we've even paid for the upfront engineering costs for them to, identify what upgrades are needed, procure long lead equipment, etc. Because not all utilities work at the pace that we'd like them to work. That's not meant to be a disparaging comment. So we wanted to start that process very early, so we can make sure that power was there when we were ready to energize the system.
On pages 7 and 8 of your direct testimony, you discuss mainline valves, or for the record, we'll refer to them as MLVs. Has Summit Carbon obtained all necessary land rights for MLVs, or is it requesting the right of eminent domain for any of those areas?
It's my understanding we have not requested the right of eminent domain, but Mr. Roy can tell you definitively. And I know we've, like the pump stations, have been securing those sites for quite some time. And it's my understanding we have a large percentage of those sites secured, but Mr. Roy can tell you exactly.
So we talked a little bit about the route and how a route could be changed. And we know that if the board were to issue an order on this or a permit, it could have changes to the route. How would any potential changes that were asked for impact these MLVs?
The only way that it would impact them is if we were outside of the 20-mile spacing, or if it's an HCA, if we were outside even a tighter spacing, then we may have to install another valve to make sure we were compliant with PHMSA. And if it were a significant reroute, which I'm hoping it wouldn't be, that may affect the location of our pump stations. So we may actually have to secure an alternative site for a pump station. But I think that would only occur in the case of a significant reroute, not minor reroutes or micro reroutes.
And just out of curiosity, what would this MLV facility look like physically? If you're describing to me and for the record what that looks like.
Yeah, I think here we've got a 50-foot by 50-foot fenced-in area. The pipe comes above ground. It has a valve that's supported, goes back below ground. Pressure indication devices on either side. It's fenced. It has some type of communication, whether that's satellite, etc., in that location, and that's it. It's a fairly simple above-ground facility.
On page 8 of your direct testimony, you discuss launcher and receiver for smart pigs. And we know that smart pigs are kind of the inspection device that you can put inside the pipe. So these launching and receiving areas, do they require any sort of a special footprint that the board should be aware of?
I'm assuming in my testimony I had the footprint, but it'd be similar to a mainline valve, and you typically like to have the launcher receiver close proximity to a road. Now it's where the spec break happens, where the pipe diameter happens, so you have access, and it will require power for valve because the launcher receiver also has valves for automation. But it's a fairly simple structure as well.
Can you locate them in the same location as the MLV or not? And if not,
it can be. It can be.
So do you have I think you said the majority of your locations you've tried to secure for the MLVs. Have you also done the same for the launcher receiver sites?
The answer is yes. And typically the launcher receiver will be at the beginning or the end of the line. And so that mainline valve at the front end of that launcher receiver will constitute an MLV. And then that spacing begins to get to the next subsequent mainline valve.
So could they be starting at the ethanol site?
Yeah, yes, we will have a launcher at the ethanol site, at each ethanol site. And then it's at every diameter change after that.
On page 8, line 22 through 23 of your direct testimony, you discuss a 0.72 design factor. I am not an engineer, so could you please explain that design factor for me, please?
That's prescribed by PHMSA, and it's 72% of the specified minimum yield strength of the pipe material. And that's standard for liquid pipeline. Where that'll change is at road crossings, so road bores, river crossings for directional drills, we'll have heavier wall pipe. And so that design factor might be a 0.6 or something that constitutes a heavier wall or thicker material. And that's just for added protection from an integrity perspective.
So what you're saying is in certain locations, you will go above and beyond the 0.72?
Yes, that's correct. Same thing with coating. So if you're in a river crossing, we'll put the fusion bond epoxy, which will be on the entire pipeline, but then on top of that, we'll put abrasion-resistant coating on top of that, so it'll have a double layer of protection. And that's because when you're locating a pipeline 20 or 30 feet below the river bottom or below a road, 8 to 10 feet or whatever the depth is below a road crossing, we don't want to interrupt and have to replace those at some point or do maintenance on those. And so we always, from an integrity perspective, put in a heavier grade material and extra coating, etc.
One of the things discussed is the Operations Control Center. For the record, we'll refer to it as the OCC. I'd love to have acronyms in the utility industry. So the OCC, can you give me a description of what this OCC will look at? And I believe I've heard throughout public information meetings, testimony, it's going to be located in Ames. What's this facility going to look like? What's its makeup?
The current plan is to have it in our current office building. It's a 2-story office building. It'll be downstairs, and it has the broadband capability, etc., to accommodate this. And it'll look much like where you're sitting now. So it'll be a series of consoles with screens, and these controllers will actually have schematics of the pipeline system. That's their area of responsibility. They'll have access to the capture facilities, and at the end of the line, the sequestration, so they can see if a pump's turned on and off, if the valve's open or closed, they can see what the pressure, the flow rate, the temperature is. And that's real time, ongoing, all the time. And then that will be manned continually. And then currently we have a simulator that's just been completed in our office now. So the SCADA platform is designed. And so as we get permitted and begin construction, we'll onboard these control center personnel well in advance of going into operation. We'll use the simulator that's been designed to train these personnel.
So what kind of actions can be taken from there? Can we shut off valves, open valves?
Yes, they have access throughout the system, so they can start and stop pumps, they can close and open valves, or they can shut down a pipeline segment or the entire pipeline segment, and there'll be operating procedures. So they have, it's very prescriptive about when an alarm sounds, what are the actions taken up to. Each of these controllers will have the discretion to take the ultimate action, which I think is shutting in the system.
So just what we've discussed throughout the day, third-party incidents where somebody doesn't do a one call, somebody hits something, they strike utility infrastructure. I think a lot of us in here probably have thought the same thing. Technology's great as long as it's working. And I know there's going to be a lot of technology as part of this project. What happens with a fiber line getting cut and you lose communications? Like, what is the redundancy plan?
Well, the good news is we're not using fiber. And I will say, just to follow up on the last question, forgive me, we do have a gentleman who will be the supervisor of the control center named Mark Velko, who actually has operated CO2 pipelines for Occidental Petroleum. So has a lot of experience in managing control centers, but obviously direct experience with CO2 pipeline. But to your point about third-party damage, that's when, we rely on the 811 system, but we also have secondary reliability measures like aerial surveillance, like people that are in operations that are traveling up and down the pipeline on a daily basis, depending on what their task is for that day or what their inspection requirements are. And then we'll have the sensors up and down the pipeline, so pressure and flow. So any indication from any of those means that there's a problem with the pipeline, that's when we deploy somebody to investigate.
So if not fiber, then what is the communication tool for information?
So it's these pressure and temperature and flow indicators along the length of the pipeline, not buried in the ditch. We've looked at fiber, and fiber is, in my experience, fiber is not used very often. I know navigators talked about fiber. The problem with fiber is two things. One is you're coming back when you install it, you can't install it under river crossings, etc. So you have breaks in your connectivity. And secondly, it's tuning it. So we've got people on our staff that have direct experience with fiber. and it's very difficult to get it tuned, and so you get a lot of false alarms. And there's a West Texas system, Mr. Skubinik and some other folks in our automation control group have direct experience with, where it didn't alarm and they had a release. They had an incident, an NGL incident. So it's not foolproof by any means. And in my opinion, the worst part about fiber, or the biggest challenge, is you're coming back and you're disrupting the farmland again, because you install the pipeline, you install the conduit, and then you come back at pull points and you pull the fiber in. So after the pipeline's done and the property's reclaimed, you're coming back and pulling the fiber and tying it all in. So you're essentially coming back twice to the construction site. So it's the temperature and flow and temperature indication along the pipeline and each of those pump stations, valve stations, and launchers receivers.
So it's a receiver system. So you have a tower, I'm assuming. The communications, I guess, is what I'm getting at.
Primary is satellite.
Okay. Let's see. On page 10, lines 12 to 13 of your direct testimony, you describe a real-time transient model. Could you please further describe what this is and how it works? And what inputs and instrumentation is it based on?
Yeah, so the SCADA system will be used to provide direct feedback in the operating pipeline. But we've also is being developed, a hydraulic model that simulates the operation of the pipeline under whatever condition may be prevalent. So discharge pressure from a certain facility, flow rate projected from that facility, and they run in parallel. So you essentially have a test, if you will, or a default case and the current operating case. So you compare those two. So in the simulated model, it may say your operating pressure should be at 1,350 pounds and your flow rate should be 2 million tons an hour, or whatever. I mean, I'm making that up. If the actual operation of the pipeline, if the controller sees something that significantly deviates from that, then he should investigate and see why that is, because this model, the hydraulic model, will have been trued up and tested and we consider to be very accurate. So if what we're seeing in real life operation deviates from that, then we can assume we may have a problem.
So the audible alarms are at the OCC, correct?
Yes.
Any sort of audible alarms that are out in the field?
There may be at the pump stations, not along the main line valves, etc.
On page 11 of your testimony, you state that the operations personnel will be located in close proximity to remote operated facilities, noting that they could respond locally if remote communications fail. So, and I know that in my prior life, my technicians had a response time that they had to adhere to in order to get to a natural gas leak. What is your response time, and what's the expectation? And maybe define proximity, close proximity, a little bit deeper.
Yeah, I think, I hate to pun on this, response time will be developed over the next several months as we have those communications with first responders, what are the location for the first responders to the proximity of the pipeline, where we think the greatest risk may be, and if it's a volunteer fire department, for instance, versus one that's on call all the time, that may play into it. And then we'll use that as one indicator on where we put our people. So where we locate them up and down the line. I can't tell you at this 10 seconds for Member Burns whether response time is going to be 15 minutes or 30 minutes or whatever. That will be determined.
Is that determined by you, or is that determined by PHMSA?
Well, in my experience, it's determined by us, but in collaboration with the first responders.
Okay. So there's, and I'm trying to learn on the CO2 stuff. I know what I had to do on my end, but so you don't have any required response time then that PHMSA sets out?
Not that I'm aware of, but I'll research that. Not that I'm aware of. Now, Mr. Dillon can tell you definitively, but I'm not aware of it.
on page 11 of your testimony, line 16, you mentioned automatic closing of sectionalizing block valves. If an anomaly is detected, that could indicate a major issue. So does this automatic closure require the communication system between the pipeline and the OCC to be functional, or can it also work if communications were down?
It can work with communications are down with the OCC because there'll be a pressure indicator upstream and downstream, and that valve will close automatically. Mr. Skubinik can, if you want to know, Mr. Skubinik can explain exactly how that occurs, but I know that can be done locally and not from the control center.
And I know at the control center, you're blindly, somewhat trusting what you're seeing is actually happening. So it says a valve closed, you assume it closed. How do you know? Like, what is the fail-safe? Like, do you send a technician out? Are they going to physically take a look at this? I mean, again, technology's great when it works.
Yeah, I think if a situation is critical enough where we're going to shut a valve or a valve shuts, we're definitely going to send personnel out to investigate. But then in the control center, depending on the operating condition of the line, there should be some indication. So if a valve shuts, then flow will stop. So you'll see a flow indication, pressure may build. So there should be some indication in the control center, some indicators, but we will definitely, if it's serious enough where they shut a valve or a valve shuts automatically, that will dispatch personnel to investigate.
So I'm assuming this is going to be similar to what I've experienced, but could you explain, public education? What's the outreach of this project? What's required of you to educate the public? Is this a one-time thing where you educate in the beginning and no education again? Is this an annual thing, an ongoing thing? How does this public education outreach look for Summit Carbon?
Yeah, it's ongoing. It'll be annual. It'll be in various forms. One will be we'll send a mailer, so you'll get information in the mail that says there's an 8-inch pipeline. It's in carbon dioxide service. It's in your area. It's crossing your property, or it's in this area. If it may have some information about what to if you notice X, if you notice a vapor cloud, or if you hear a noise, then call this number. And we'll have a contact information to the control center. And then aside from that, many times Mr. Dillon and I've been involved in some where you'll have community events, whether it's obviously with the first responders, but if it's local businesses or schools, whether they just want to learn about CO2, whether they want to learn about pipeline operations, about what we do, or any risk associated with it, then those can be conducted as well, but they're not scheduled annually like the public awareness update would be to those affected or potentially affected.
So we talked a little bit early in our conversation about calling 811, doing a one call. What is the expectation for landowners if they have this pipeline going through? Like, is it just scratching the surface? Is it taken out and have a chisel plow out? They're doing field work. They need to do a 811. They're digging post holes. They're planting a tree. When do they need to be making these phone calls around your pipeline?
So we'll give them an as-built, every landowner, so you'll know across your field is exactly 4 foot deep or exactly 5 foot deep, etc. And so what we'll ask is if you're digging within 2 feet of the pipeline laterally, we'd like you to notify us. So if you're putting a post hole in, and if you're digging anywhere on that 50-foot easement and you're uncomfortable, please call us. We'll come out and locate the pipeline. That's what we prefer to do. So even if you're putting in posts for a fence and you plan on being 4 foot on either side of the center line of the pipe, please call us. We'll send somebody out at our expense. We'll locate the pipeline and we'll say, here's where it is. We'll mark it, and you know exactly where it is. If you're going through your normal farming activities and you're plowing or you're disking or whatever you're doing above the pipeline, as long as you're comfortable that if you know it's 4-foot depth of cover, that you're going 18 inches or 24 inches, that works for us. But if you're uncomfortable, then we would expect you to call us. If you want to call 811, that's up to you. But as you know, 811 gets, depending on the area that it's in, can field a lot of different notifications. So, but I would just suggest, and we'll put this in our public information, that if you're concerned at any point about where the pipeline is or the activity in and around it, please call us. The other thing, Mr. Board Member Burns, is, over time, our operations personnel will get to know landowners and hopefully establish a relationship. And so they need to feel comfortable that I know Dave Smith is the guy that's typically in my area. I can call Dave and say, hey, here's what I want to do. Can you swing by? Or can you give me some guidance? Or can you have somebody locate the line? Those types of things.
I think the last question that I have, on page 4 of your rebuttal testimony, you noted that Summit has taken actions to comply with PHMSA's June 2nd, 2022 advisory bulletin. Can you describe some of those actions that you've taken due to that bulletin?
And this is a response to the Satarsh incident?
I believe so. Let's see, I got page 4 rebuttal testimony. I guess I didn't write down the line. Yeah, it would be.
Yeah, it's just, obviously, we read the investigative report, and one of those actions is to make sure that we understand where the high consequence areas are, the could effects, the HPOs and the OPOs, and that we've incorporated 2D or overland flow in our dispersant modeling. We'll obviously make sure that geohazard analysis, et cetera, is completed, and that any and all that will be represented in our quantitative risk assessment, and then whatever appropriate actions we need to from an integrity management standpoint will be incorporated, and in our operating and maintenance procedures. So, I mean, obviously with Denbury and Satarsha, they missed on the front end by not identifying the geohazard and the risk associated with it, but they missed on the back end in the response, public awareness, and emergency response. So, essentially, if they would have followed PHMSA guidelines, maybe that event could have been avoided, but that was a significant weather event, and those do happen. And so it's understanding where that risk is and then responding as soon as practical to any type of event like that to make sure that your pipeline still has the integrity that's intended.
So I forgot I do have one other little note here. Heard this multiple times the last 2 weeks on different landowners that have railroad tracks next to them. And one of the things, and it does seem to be a trend, is that railroad track need to be approached at a 90-degree angle. That seems to be, on all the KMZ maps and all the things that I've researched, it seems like you guys do cross at a 90-degree angle. Is that a requirement of the railroad company? Is that something you're trying to accomplish as a company? Or is that just something unusual that's trending?
Well, I will say, I think we crossed 41 rail lines in Iowa, and I think we've applied for all 41 permits, and I think we received 14. And railroads kind of dictate the terms. I don't know if all 41 require us to cross at a 90, but generally that's my experience. And they're very cognizant of their angle of repose. And they're very specific around the depth of cover that they want you to, cross under what depth they want you to cross under their rail line. And so Mr. Skubinik can tell you definitively what my assumption is. It's a requirement from the railroads to cross at a 90. Just like most DOT permits would prefer you cross at a 90. Sometimes they'll let you cross at an angle, but it's typically county roads want you to cross at a 90.
Thank you. I think that's all the questions I have of Board Member Marks.
Just a couple of clarifications. Mr. Powell, you mentioned the communications method from the pipeline to the OCC. That was satellite, you said?
Yeah, as a primary.
Do you know what the reliability of that communications network would be?
I don't. I know there's redundant. Well, I can get that information for you.
And then Board Member Burns touched on the response time. And you said there wasn't a defined response time. So my understanding with Satartia is that the valve around that incident was remotely closed, but later it was found that it did not actually fully close. So wouldn't it be important to have a defined response time in the event of a rupture?
Well, absolutely. What I meant to say is that we haven't established what that is at this point, so we're working on that. Mr. Dillon can comment further on it when he testifies, but yes, I think there definitely needs to be a response time, and that response time may vary depending on where we are along the pipeline route, what's in proximity, what's the potential impact of a release. It may vary. It may not be 15 minutes across the entire footprint, but it will clearly be defined before we go into operation. It just hasn't been defined as we sit here today.
Thank you. No further questions.
Okay, thank you. We will turn the witness back over to Summit for redirect. Following Summit, the other parties will have an opportunity to ask clarification questions as it relates to redirect only.
No redirect questions, Your Honor.
Well, I made that easy. Thank you. Appreciate it. Okay. Hold on. Okay, Mr. Powell, you're not excused, but you may step down. You may be called back. In fact, I think it's probably safe to say you will be called back. But for this evening, you're done. So thank you.
I just have to place an objection on the record. If we're not allowed to ask questions following the board's questions, I would object to not being able to follow up on those questions.
Okay, thanks. Okay, with that, we will recess until 8 a.m. in the morning. We'll look forward to seeing you bright and early. Thank you.